What I will be doing in this paper is elaborating considerably on a discussion that followed a seminar which I gave in Paderborn 3 years ago. The seminar was on the Roman-Persian War and its possible impact on the Quranic world. But after the seminar, we got onto the subject, and there were various interlocutors there. We got onto the subject of the rise of Islam and the secret of Islam's success. So this paper is going to be on the absolutely essential core of evidence for supporting that proposition. And the central evidence comes from the Quran itself. So unlike most other speakers, I'm not talking about input into the Quran, I'm talking about output. Before I start, I should just give you a view of how I envisage, of what I envisage Mecca to have been in the early 7th century. Now, it's a view completely at variance with that of Stephen Schumacher. Now, I'll read what I have written down. Independent evidence, above all the material evidence of growing prosperity in towns on the Syrian fringe of the desert, the Badia, leads me to accept the seerah's picture of Mecca as a city dominating the northern trade routes. Other extraneous sources corroborate the seerah's account of 5 notable episodes in the political history of Arabia in the 6th century, namely, the persecution of Christians in Najran in 623, the subsequent Ethiopian expedition to oust Yusuf, Jewish ruler of Yemen, a subsequent rebellion by the occupying Ethiopian forces, which installed Abraha as a ruler. Abraha's attempt to project his authority north into the Hijaz in 552, and the Persian occupation of Yemen in 571. Now, for all of these, there is independent evidence, chiefly epigraphic. I am therefore ready to put my trust in the main lines of the seerah's account of pre-Islamic Mecca. For me, then, Mecca had many more inhabitants than 500. It was very far from being a scrabbled, remote village. It had achieved a dominating position in the Hijaz by the late 6th century, despite being off the direct south-north route. And it had done this as the Kaaba rose to become the premier sanctuary of the Hijaz and adjoining regions, and as the market associated with the sanctuary grew in importance. Late 6th century Mecca may, on this scenario, be envisaged as the leading city-state in the Hijaz. So I would introduce the noun city-state to replace the noun village. The leading city-state in the Hijaz, with ramified commercial and political connections south, north, and east. Incidental references to trade by land and sea in the Quran provide confirmation. So do notions taken from the counting house discernible in the Quran, reckoning and calculating, weighing and balancing, wages, sales, loans, pledges for debt, loss and fraud, etc., all transferred to the moral sphere. So with that preliminary, I will now come to my subject. In my view, and I hope in your view, the Quran is the single most important source to have survived from the 7th century. It is a contemporary document of quite extraordinary character. It contains the voluminous words which came forth from the Prophet's mouth as he broadcast Allah's messages to a small but growing group of believers, and through them to the Arabs at large and the world beyond Arabia. It is therefore not a witness to what was said. We are not forced to rely on first-hand testimony. We can, as it were, project ourselves backward in time and listen to Muhammad and take account of the many types of speech acts which he performs: warning, instructing, reprimanding, encouraging, rebutting, criticism, legislating, etc. We can therefore watch as the Prophet impressed the new faith, so well tailored to the realities of Arabia, on his listeners, and guided the first actions of the Ummah, the community of believers. The Quran both transcends and is immersed in time. The central cosmological message is a universal, eternal truth. The ritual and moral precepts enunciated are for all time. But the circumstances of the time of the Prophet's preaching, conventionally dated between 610 and his death in 632, could not but have an impact on what he said and how he said it. There are numerous allusions, some clearer than others, to key events in the recent past, notably to the Hijrah, to the Great War being fought in the north, and to the three main engagements fought against the Quraysh of Mecca and their allies. The deep past is no less present, lowering over the present, providing much useful material with which to browbeat the unbelievers. Numerous cautionary tales were culled from the deep past, involving figures from the Old Testament, the most prominent being Abraham, Noah, Moses, and Arab prophets, Hud, Salih, Shuaib, who were rejected by their peoples. Ruins and strange rock formations in the desert testified to the fate of peoples punished by God for disregarding his prophets. Finally, linear time, structured by the Prophet's preaching, which clearly evolved from his first brief, half-coherent apocalyptic utterances through his arguments with Meccans who questions his prophetic mission, to his later polemics against Jews and Christians, and authorization of the war for faith. That is, his preaching evolved with time. Now, the conventional order of the canonical text, surahs being arranged by length, the longest first, the shortest last, was, well, I hesitate to say when it was established, but the Quran, I think we can say, it was probably the conventional order. I suspect, I'm looking to Nikolai Sinai, I suspect that the conventional order was established at the time that the surahs were collected together, a process datable to the second half of the 7th century, maybe early, maybe later. Datable why? Because of the evidence of hadith subject to a proper isnad matn analysis, which can be placed at the end of the 7th century and refer back to the collection, and confirmed by radiocarbon dating of early parchment sheets of the Quran. Now, surahs may be rearranged into rough chronological order on the basis of three principal criteria, and here I'm entirely dependent on old Quranic scholars and their distinguished successor here present. The three principal criteria being mean length of individual verses, language, and topic. They may be divided between those in which material delivered at Mecca predominates and those predominantly belonging to the Medinan period, more militaristic, with more polemics against Jews and Christians, above all more concerned with legal and ritual prescription for the faithful. We can listen as Muhammad develops God's message, rebutting criticisms, arguing against idolatry and the existence of other gods, and issuing more and more detailed guidance to the faithful. In this paper, I shall be focusing on three late surahs, which I believe can help to explain the extraordinary phenomenon of Islam's success in the 7th and 8th centuries. Now, the first of these surahs is Surah 2, much the longest and universally agreed to be late. I'm using the translation of Yusuf Ali, which I've checked in as far as I can against the original Arabic text. I take it from the Holy Quran, published by the Islamic Propagation Center International in 1946. Surah 2 contains material in its last part which lays down laws for the new community of believers, performing a function akin to that of the early law codes issued by Germanic rulers in the West after the destruction of the Roman political order. It opens with a long denunciation of Jews and Christians. It is a central section, verses 125 to 167, with which I'm concerned. This deals with the Kaaba at Mecca, the premier pagan center of Arabia, attributing its original construction to Abraham, of which more later. The direction of prayer has been changed. It is an arresting passage, the only reference to dissent among Muhammad's listeners. I quote Yusuf Ali's translation. You know, by no means the best translation, but as it were, authorized by English-speaking Muslims in England. I quote, "The fools among the people will say, what hath turned them from the Qibla to which they were used? Say, to God belong both east and west. He guideth whom he will to a way that is straight." That is verse 142. A second response is given in the following verse, 143. "And we appointed the Qibla to which thou wast used only to test those who followed the apostle from those who would turn on their heels. Indeed, it is momentous, except to those guided by God." Finally, the new direction of prayer is specified in verse 144. "Now shall we turn thee to a Qibla that shall please thee. Turn then thy face in the direction of the sacred mosque Al-Masjid. Wherever ye are, turn your faces in that direction." Now, several observations can be made on these passages. First, the old Qibla, wherever it was pointed, had evidently been used for some time. The faithful had become used to it, and some objected openly to the change. 2, the change was recent. The objections have just been lodged. It follows that the Sirah, the life of the Prophet, written by Ibn Ishaq and revised by Ibn Hisham, who died in 833, is wrong to place it very soon after the arrival of the Muslims in Medina in 622, as it does in a single, bald, unelaborated statement. 3, 2 different answers are given to explain the change. One, which to me at least makes sense and should have worked, that God is everywhere. That is, a direction of prayer is needed, but may point anywhere, the object being to ensure that the whole congregation face in the same direction. The second is rather extraordinary. God has been testing the faith of the believers with the wrong Qibla for a number of years, and has now fixed on the true, permanent one. Fourth, the objective of the first Qibla is not specified, but has generally been thought to be Jerusalem, in particular the Holy Mount, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Akbar Mosque now stand. Jerusalem, holy city of Jews and Christians, recipients of the first 2 revelations, was equally venerated by Muslims, recipient of the third. Hence, the pointing of the Qibla at Jerusalem was natural, reasonable, perhaps imposed by the new faith. Fifth, the object of the new Qibla was the Kaaba at Mecca, the large cube to which idolaters made annual pilgrimages from all over Arabia, and where they made sacrifices to the gods, to their gods. It was not simply the change of Qibla to which objections were voiced, but probably its direction. This is an objection which we can well understand. How on earth could the Prophet be instructing the faithful to redirect their prayers from the holy city of monotheist peoples of the book to the pagan cult center of Arabia? Were they now expected to venerate it, perhaps even to go on pilgrimage to it? Might they be expected to follow pagan practice and sacrifice animals to God, as if he were close at hand and would appreciate the meat and the blood of the sacrifice? For the moment, though, let us just note the brute fact of the new Meccan Qibla and try to fix the date of its inauguration. The outer limits are the Hijra in 622 and Muhammad's attempt to go on pilgrimage in 628. We may narrow the time frame. Several years have probably passed since the Hijra. It is also unlikely that fighting was still going on. That is, the change was probably announced after the last major military confrontation, the Battle of the Ditch in 627, a close blockade rather than aggressive siege of Medina. The most likely date then is late 627 or early 628, either before or after the meeting between Muhammad and the Meccan leaders at Hudaybiyah, which led to an armistice. I come now to the second surah, Surah 22. Muslims were indeed instructed to go on pilgrimage to the Kaaba, and Muhammad himself would succeed in doing so in 629. The instructions were issued in another late surah, Surah 22, verses 23 to 38. Abraham had been told to sanctify God's house. I quote, "For those who compass it round, or stand up, or bow, or prostrate themselves." He'd been told to proclaim the pilgrimage for men to come on foot or on lean mounts, and to, I quote, "celebrate the name of God through the days appointed, over the cattle which he has provided for them. Then eat ye thereof, and feed the distressed ones in want. Then let them complete the rites prescribed for them, perform their vows, and circumambulate the ancient house." After stressing that it is lawful to eat cattle, the faithful are told to, I quote, "shun the abomination of idols, and shun the word that is false." Verse 30. A few verses further on, the surah returns to the subject of sacrifice. I quote, "The sacrificial camels we have made for you as among the symbols from God. In them is good for you. Then pronounce the name of God over them as they line up. When they are down on their sides, eat ye thereof, and feed such as live in contentment, and such as beg with due humility. Thus have we made animals subject to you, that ye may be grateful. It is not their meat, nor their blood that reaches God. It is your piety that reaches him." Verses 36 to 7. So, it was the full set of pagan rituals which was being prescribed for Muslims. The Prophet was telling them to behave in every respect like pagans in the sacred month and in the sacred precincts. They were to circumambulate the Kaaba and to bring animals for sacrifice. Some details are added in Surah 5, again late, verses 2 to 4, about the animals whom they were not allowed to eat, which they were not allowed to eat. Game, since hunting was prohibited during the pilgrimage. From incidental references in those same verses, it may be inferred that they were to wear traditional pilgrim garb and to garland the sacrificial animals in the traditional way. It is clear then that Muhammad was authorizing his followers to venerate the pagan sanctuary, to adopt pagan rites, and to carry out pagan sacrifices. There were only two caveats. They were to disregard the idols crowded into and around the Kaaba, and to remember that the supreme, omnipotent, and omniscient God, whose power was imprinted on the landscape of Arabia, was not concerned with the meat and the blood, but with their prayers. A pagan sacrifice was transformed into something sacred by the attitude with which it was carried out. What a contrast with the adamant opposition of early Christians to sacrifices during the pagan crackdowns in the 3rd century Roman Empire. Apart from direct commands from God to pray towards the Kaaba and to go on pilgrimage, the faithful were given an explanation in human terms, and we've already seen this. Abraham, they were told, was the original builder. I quote from Surah 2, verses 125 to 7. Remember, we made the house Al-Bayt a place of assembly for men and a place of safety. And take ye the station of Abraham as a place of prayer. And we covenanted with Abraham and Ismail that they should sanctify my house for those who compass it round or use it as a retreat or bow or prostrate themselves. And remember, Abraham said, my Lord made this a city of peace. Make this a city of peace and feed its people with fruits, such of them as believe in God and the last day. And remember, Abraham and Ismail raised the foundations of the house. That last sentence comes after a gap. This provided the justification for the change in the direction of prayer, discussed later in the same surah. And now what's interesting about all of this is that there are so very few references to pilgrimage, the Kaaba, and above all, Abraham's founding of the Kaaba in the Quran, all, with one possible exception, in very late surahs. Now, there are two other passages which associate the building of the Kaaba with Abraham. Surah 3 is undoubtedly like Surah 2. It is long and makes a clear reference to the Battle of Uhud in 625 in verses 165 to 7. It is largely taken up with polemics against unbelievers and a comparatively conciliatory distancing of Muslims from the other peoples of the book. It is Muslims who are being addressed in verses 95 to 101, which refer to the Kaaba. I quote, this has already obviously been referred to. The first house appointed for men was that at Bakka, full of blessing and of guidance for all kind of beings. In it are signs manifest, the station of Abraham. Whoever enters it attains security. Pilgrimage thereto is a duty men owe to God. Those who can afford the journey are those who can afford the journey. But if any deny faith, God stands not in need of any of his creatures. Say, O people of the book, why reject ye the signs of God, when God is himself witness to all ye do? These are verses 96 to 8. Why Mecca is called Bakka remains a mystery, unless it is an early mistake of orthography or a play on the names Kaaba, or on the name Kaaba, which is inverted. The foundation of the Kaaba is also attributed to Abraham in Surah 22 on pilgrimage, already cited. I quote, Behold, we gave the site to Abraham, the house. Associate not anything with me, and sanctify my house for those who compass it round. Verse 26. Now, Abraham features in the Quran more frequently than any other figure from the Old Testament. He is the first true monotheist who believed in an all-powerful God. He truly submitted, being ready to sacrifice his son Isaac at God's command. He is a fierce opponent of idolatry. But in almost all the Quran, no connection is made between this exemplary believer and the foundation of the Kaaba until the three late surahs I have just quoted, with a single exception. A passage in what is patently a Meccan surah, number 14, focused on God's power to create and to destroy, and on the imminent day of judgment. Abraham is abruptly and suddenly mentioned in verse 35. I quote, "Remember Abraham said, 'O my Lord, make this city one of peace and security, and preserve me and my sons from worshipping idols. O our Lord, I have made some of my offspring to dwell in a valley without cultivation by thy sacred house, in order, O our Lord, that they may establish regular prayer. So fill the hearts of some among men with love towards them, and feed them with fruits, so that they may give thanks.'" Surah 14, verses 35 to 7. Abraham's prayer continues to verse 41, after which the surah reverts to Meccan themes. Now, in my view, but Nikolai disagrees in print, given the abrupt changes of subject at the start and close of Abraham's prayer, it looks to me like an insertion of late material into an early surah. Certainly its presence in Surah 14 is anomalous and does not detract from the circumstantial evidence, namely the late dates of Surahs 2, 3, and 22, for placing the first association of Abraham with the Kaaba in the Medinan period of Muhammad's mission, almost certainly, as argued above, in 628. Is this still working? Ah, yes, it is. Why then was the change of Qibla ordered? Why did the new universal religion, which looked to an ahuman, unsubscribable, uncircumscribable divinity, infinitely remote, omniscient, omnipotent, I note, rather akin to the fate of whom pagan Arabs were vaguely aware, why did it embrace the premier pagan cult center of Arabia with all its trappings? Why were the faithful's prayer to be directed at the very place where pagans worship their gods, a place full of idols? The answer must be sought in the circumstances of the time. So that then makes the Quran a historical document of immense importance. 6 years on from the Hijrah, in 628, the Ummah was beleaguered, not in the sense of being besieged or blockaded. The blockade had ended sometime several months earlier, but because Muhammad was finding it difficult to break into Mecca's network of alliances and to propagate the new faith across Arabia. This was made all too clear in 627, when the Meccans and their chief nomad allies advanced on Medina. They didn't press the siege which followed. There was no military thrust into the oasis. It looks as if the operation was not intended to eradicate the Ummah and kill the renegade Quraysh at its heart, an internecine act which would have caused shock throughout Arabia, but as a demonstration of the overwhelming power of Mecca. It can be viewed then as the first move in a diplomatic minuet between the emigrants and their home city, or rather between the home city and the emigrants. The second act is described in some detail in the Sirah. Muhammad decided to go on the Umrah, the little pilgrimage, in 628 with a large party. He donned the customary pilgrimage garb and took the customary animals for sacrifice. The Quraysh barred the way. Muhammad took a side route through a pass to the small depression of Hudaybiyah, to the north of Mecca, on the edge of the sacred area. There he and his party halted and held talks with Quraysh notables, headed by Abu Sufyan. The negotiations were evidently tough. The Quraysh would not allow Muhammad to go ahead with the pilgrimage that year. They refused to recognize him as the apostle of God, insisting that he be referred to by his patronymic in the final agreement, by his position in the kinship structure of Mecca. Equally, they refused to recognize Allah as God, again insisting that the wording of the agreement should simply refer to him as Allah, in effect as one God among many. Conversion to Islam was allowed, but no Quraysh could move to Medina without the permission of their guardian, whereas anyone wishing to move back to Mecca was free to do so. Now, it's plain from the terms of the agreement that all the advantage in these negotiations lay with Mecca, which I think we can see from circumstances of the time. And which we can see from the wording of the final document. Now, it was in fact the Seerah's interest in these two phrases, the first about the Prophet and the second about Allah, which it discusses at length and finds hard to explain, which alerted me to the dominant position of Mecca in these negotiations. The Quranic evidence I found later and was delighted to find. Now, so we have to ask ourselves, what on earth was the concession made by Muhammad to basically to gain an armistice and to gain permission for the Muslims to propagate the faith? Well, the answer is there. It wasn't made in the negotiations, it was made beforehand. It was a huge concession made by Muhammad, namely incorporation of the Kaaba and all the rites of pilgrimage into the new religion, which, of course, would have as a consequence the integration of Mecca and all things Mecca into the new religious order. This he made very plain by his attempt to go on pilgrimage. In return, the Quraysh made two concessions of their own. First, the armistice, to last 10 years. Second, the key concession to which I've just referred. Muhammad was allowed to make agreements with non-Qurayshis. In other words, the Quraysh were giving up their formal opposition to Islam and were allowing the Bedouin tribes freedom to choose between themselves and the Ummah. From that point on, the Muslims could set about proselytizing in Arabia with real hopes of success. The various passages quoted above from Surahs 2, 3, 5, 14 and 22, in which the change of Qibla is announced, pilgrimage is authorized, and the polytheist sanctuary is shown to have been founded by Abraham as a place of worship of God, testify to the effort made by Muhammad to win over the faithful and gain backing for his initiative before the Hudaybiyah meeting. Muhammad could not have made his offer publicly without the wholehearted support of the Ummah. Once the offer was made and accepted, the new religion can break out from encirclement in Medina, could begin to work on minds throughout Arabia, a land where the power of God had imprinted itself in the rock formations and ruins which spoke of communal punishment for sins, and where it continued to manifest itself in the flora and fauna which came to life in so hostile an environment. Within 2 years, in 630, the balance had shifted dramatically. Now it was the turn for Muhammad, his followers, and a large force of allies to march on Mecca, to receive the submission of the notables, and to cleanse the Kaaba of its idols. The secret of Islam's military and political success is, I believe, to be found in the fusion of the interests of the faithful on one hand, with those of the governing elite of Mecca on the other, brought about by the decision to incorporate the Kaaba and its rites into the new religion. The combination of a dynamic faith and a city with ramified political and economic networks proved lethal in the years following the Prophet's death in 632. Arabia was united under the rule of the twin cities of Medina and Mecca, and in 634 they could embark on the conquest of the whole Levant, Persian as well as Roman. The conjoining of two utterly different polities, the one religiously powered, the other with well-developed statecraft, led to an explosive expansion of Arabs from Arabia. Tensions remained, of course, between pure believers and pragmatists, and broke out in open civil war twice in the 7th century. Each ended with the victory of the pragmatists and rule by members of the old Meccan elite, first Muawiyah, son of Abu Sufyan, second Abd al-Malik. But the driving force of faith remained as strong as ever, as it does today.